The night Sarah Rowan believed her life had ended began with a roar that split the sky. Wind slammed against Willow Creek like a force determined to erase her world, and within minutes the storm tore apart the small fragrance shop she had spent 10 years nurturing. Timber cracked, glass burst, shelves collapsed in a single violent sweep, scattering the work of a decade across the street like pieces of a life she could no longer gather. By sunrise, the lantern house lay in ruins. Neighbors stepped around the debris, whispering as if her loss were a secret too heavy to speak aloud. Her livelihood is gone. She won't rise from this. Each voice stung, but something unexpected settled in her chest. A quietness that didn't match the devastation around her. Not numbness, not denial. A stillness she couldn't name. She sank to her knees among the remnants of her work, the morning cold pressing against her hands. "Lord, why now?" she whispered. She expected despair to consume her. Instead, a thin thread of peace held her upright, defying every shattered piece of wood and glass around her. The storm had taken her shop, but not the strange, unexplainable calm unfolding inside her. What she didn't know was that this night was not the collapse of her purpose. It was the opening scene of it, the moment God would begin revealing what loss could never steal, the moment restoration quietly stepped into motion, long before she could see it. And though she felt alone in the ruins, heaven was already moving. Before the storm rewrote her life, Sarah Rowan lived in a quiet rhythm that felt almost sacred. Her small cottage sat at the edge of Willow Creek, where dawn arrived with the scent of pine drifting through open windows, and evenings hummed with the soft brush of wind against the trees. Life there didn't demand much from her. It simply asked her to breathe, to create, and to trust that her small offerings mattered. The lantern house had been her refuge. Inside those wooden walls, she crafted fragrances, soothing blends, and comforting keepsakes meant to bring peace to weary hearts. Each bottle, each handmade item carried a whispered prayer, something she had learned from her mother, who prayed over everything she touched. Her father, a gentle traveling pastor, used to say, "Purpose rarely shows itself in calm weather. But one day you'll understand the why." Their voices lived in the corners of her memory, both tender and unfinished. Losing them years earlier carved a hollow she never truly filled, so the shop became her way of keeping them close. Every morning, she walked before sunrise. The path wound along the creek, where water moved over smooth stones in a song that reminded her she wasn't alone. Sometimes she spoke aloud, soft, simple gratitude. Sometimes she said nothing at all. But every time she felt God near in the quiet. Her closest friend, Michael Hale, often met her at the shop with a toolbox in hand, a carpenter with steady hands and a calm presence. He repaired shelves, reinforced door frames, and listened without rushing her. He had a way of speaking truth gently. "God builds with what we think is broken," he'd say, wiping sawdust from his palms. She never knew if he meant her shop or her heart. Even with the peace she cultivated, an ache lived beneath the surface, a longing to know she was truly walking in God's purpose. Some days she felt certain. Other days she wondered if she was simply surviving, drifting between memories and dreams. Then came the whispers the community never meant to wound her with. After the storm, as she stood among the ruins, the words reached her like small blows. She should have planned better. Maybe it wasn't meant to last. No one recovers from a loss like this. She didn't respond. She didn't defend what they couldn't understand. But inside, something fragile bent under the weight of their opinions. Losing the shop felt like losing her parents all over again, losing the last piece of what made her life feel anchored. Days later, the town council delivered a letter. The message was cold, almost clinical. Rebuilding required costly permits she didn't have, and until she obtained them, the lantern house could not reopen. The paper shook in her hands. It wasn't just another obstacle. It was the final declaration that her sanctuary was gone. That night, rain tapped gently against her cottage window. Sarah slid to the floor, unable to keep her strength upright any longer. God, what am I supposed to do now? She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She just let the question hang in the dim room as tears blurred everything around her. Her whisper barely lifted above the sound of rain, but heaven heard it. In the days that followed, she sought clarity the only way she knew how. Returning to the forest trail her parents once took her on during hard seasons. The path felt heavier now, the trees taller, the memories sharper. She sat on an old stump they had used as a prayer place long ago, running her fingers over its weathered bark. Lord, if everything is gone, what am I supposed to hold on to now? Silence met her, but it wasn't hollow. It wrapped around her with a quiet steadiness, as if God answered without words. A calm rose inside her, small but undeniable. So she prayed again, this time with a steadier breath. Father, guide me. If there is a purpose in this, show me where to step next. For the first time since the storm, the weight inside her shifted, not lifted, carried. The week after her prayer in the forest felt like walking through a life that no longer belonged to her. Every corner of Willow Creek reminded Sarah of what she once had. The warm storefront she opened each morning, the soft bell above the door, the fragrance of her creations drifting into the street. Now, only the broken frame of the lantern house remained, wrapped in yellow caution tape that flapped in the wind like a cruel echo. People passed by with a mix of pity and certainty, as though her future had already been decided. Poor thing, she must feel so lost. She had a good run, but that shop was her only skill. Some people just aren't meant to rebuild. The judgments came in fragments, whispered but sharp enough to cut. Sarah tried to ignore them, but every comment found its way under her skin. Losing the shop was painful. Losing her identity felt devastating. A few days later, she was called to meet the town council. She arrived with hope tucked carefully inside her, thin but present. Maybe they would show mercy, maybe they would understand. But the moment she stepped into the old municipal hall, she sensed the answer waiting in the stillness. 4 council members sat behind a long wooden table. Papers were stacked neatly in front of them, their expressions already settled into polite firmness. "Miss Rowan," one began, folding his hands, "we've reviewed the structural damage of your shop." Another cleared her throat. "Given the extent of the destruction, rebuilding will require full compliance with the new commercial zoning guidelines." Sarah nodded, hands clasped tightly. "I understand. I'm willing to work with whatever you need." The first councilman exhaled, almost regretful. "The issue is the cost. These permits require a substantial investment. Without them, the Lantern House cannot reopen." The words hit harder than the storm winds had. She felt the breath leave her chest. I don't have the funds right now," she admitted quietly. "Then we strongly advise you to consider closing the business permanently. It may be time to move on." Move on. As if 10 years of work, prayer, and purpose could be dismissed like an outdated sign taken down from a doorway. She walked out of the hall slowly, the door closing behind her with a finality that stung. On the steps outside, she released a breath that trembled. The council hadn't just shut down a building, they had shut down a dream, a calling, a piece of her identity she didn't know how to replace. Word spread quickly through the town. By evening, she overheard the latest conclusions. She'll have to leave Willow Creek now. She can't survive without that shop. This is probably the end of her story here. The weight of those assumptions pressed into her deepest insecurities. She returned to her cottage, exhaustion settling into her bones. Rain began gently outside, soft and steady, mirroring the ache within her. Inside, the remnants of her old life surrounded her, unfinished creations, dried flowers, labels she once wrote with care. She touched them with a sense of mourning. These weren't just items. They were prayers shaped by her hands. She felt the walls close in around her, the silence louder than any storm. All the questions she had pushed aside now surged forward. Had she misheard God? Had she built something meant to fall? Was she clinging to a purpose that was never hers? As the room dimmed with the fading light, she sank onto the floor, unable to hold herself upright. She didn't cry loudly. She didn't break dramatically. She simply let her heart rest in the honesty of her pain. "Lord," she whispered, "am I failing? Or are you leading me somewhere I can't see?" No answer came. Not yet. Just the quiet patter of rain outside, steady and patient, as though heaven was waiting for the right moment to speak. In that silence, Sarah realized her greatest loss wasn't the shop. It was the belief that she still had a place in the story God was writing. And for the first time, fear whispered that maybe the town was right. Maybe everything really had ended. Sarah woke before sunrise the next morning, the air in her cottage cold enough to make her breath visible. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, drawn by something she couldn't name. The sky was pale, the world still, as though creation itself paused to listen. She followed the familiar path toward the forest, the one her parents had walked with her during seasons of confusion and fear. The trail was damp from the night's rain, leaves glistening with drops that caught the faint morning light. Each step felt heavier than the last. But she kept walking, her heart quietly reaching for answers she didn't have words for yet. When she reached the old stump, her family's prayer place, she stopped. This spot had carried countless memories, her mother's gentle prayers, her father's soft encouragement. Her own childhood worries eased under their voices. Now it felt like standing inside a memory and a question all at once. Sarah sat, letting the silence settle around her. For a long moment she said nothing. She simply breathed, letting the weight inside her surface without fighting it. Every loss, every judgment, every unanswered question rose like a tide. "What do you want from me now?" she finally whispered. "If one chapter is ending, what comes next?" The forest didn't answer, yet she felt something shift, an awareness that she wasn't alone. It wasn't a voice or a sign, but a quiet steadiness she had felt only in her deepest moments of surrender. Her spirit recognized it even before her mind did. Purpose rarely looks like what we expect. Sometimes it begins with being stripped of what we thought we couldn't live without. Her heart trembled as she leaned forward, resting her hands on the stump. She let herself speak simply, honestly, no flourish, no formality. "Lord, guide me. Give me strength to walk the path you prepared." The prayer was small, but it steadied her. She exhaled slowly, the weight shifting, not gone, but carried by hands stronger than hers. She closed her eyes, letting gratitude settle gently in her chest, not for the loss, but for the quiet assurance that God had not abandoned her in it. A memory of her father surfaced, his voice soft. "When everything falls apart, listen. God often speaks the clearest in the empty spaces." Sarah opened her eyes, absorbing the quiet truth of the forest around her. She didn't feel whole, but she felt held, and that was enough to rise from the stump with a new resolve. The path ahead was still unclear, but she sensed something waiting, a step she hadn't yet seen, a direction she hadn't considered. God was doing something beneath the surface, and though she couldn't trace it, she could trust it. She turned back toward the village, walking slowly, carrying a peace that didn't match her circumstances, but matched the presence that had met her in the quiet. And in that stillness, she understood, even in loss, God was shaping her for something she had not yet imagined. If Sarah's journey is touching your heart, pause for a moment and stay with this message. Her story is only beginning, and what God is preparing next will reveal why the storm didn't have the final word. Before we continue, take a second to support this channel so more people can hear stories of faith, restoration, and purpose. If you haven't yet, subscribe, like this video, and share where you're watching from so we can pray for your city and your family. Your engagement helps us spread hope to those who feel like everything has fallen apart. Now, let's return to Sarah, because God was about to move in a way she could never have predicted. A week after her quiet prayer in the forest, Sarah awoke to a soft rustling outside her cottage. When she opened the door, the morning air rushed in, cold, crisp, and carrying something unexpected. An envelope lay on the ground, no name, no seal, no indication of who had left it. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. Inside was a single line written in careful handwriting. "What was lost has moved. Go to the old chapel at dusk." She read it again, uncertain whether to fear it or trust it. The old chapel had been abandoned for years, unused, forgotten, its wooden door stuck halfway open like a sigh. It held memories of weddings, gatherings, prayers whispered through grief and joy. But no one had stepped inside for a long time. All day, Sarah debated what the message meant. Was it a cruel joke, a sign, a misguided attempt at comfort? By late afternoon, she still didn't know. But something in her spirit whispered to go, quietly, steadily, like a thread pulling her forward. As dusk settled over Willow Creek, she made her way up the hill. The chapel appeared through the trees, its silhouette dark against the fading sky. She noticed something immediately. A warm glow spilled from inside, soft and steady. Her breath caught. Lanterns, simple, metal-framed lanterns, hung along the walls and rested on old wooden beams. Their gentle light illuminated the room without overwhelming it, casting long, peaceful shadows that made the chapel feel alive again. Then she saw them. Michael stood near the front, wiping dust from a pew. Mrs. Alden from the library polished one of the salvaged shelves from Sarah's shop. The baker's assistant rearranged a table. 3 men who used to visit her store in silence were sorting through boxes filled with the few creations the storm hadn't destroyed. They all looked up when she stepped inside. "We didn't want your work to end in the street," Michael said softly. "We gathered everything we could." Mrs. Alden stepped forward, her hands gentle but firm. "People found peace in the things you made. We thought, Mike, maybe God wants this place to breathe again." Another voice added, "And maybe he wants you here, guiding it." Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed. She expected grief to meet her here. Instead, restoration stood all around her, restoration she had not asked for, not expected, and certainly not orchestrated. Why would you do this?" she whispered. Michael's voice held steady conviction. "Because God uses what survives the storm. We're just placing it where it belongs." Emotion rose in her chest, not loud, not dramatic, but deep enough to steady her knees. She walked slowly along the pews, touching the items salvaged from the lantern house. Each one carried a memory, a prayer, a piece of her calling she thought had been washed away. But here they were, saved, honored, given new purpose. She felt God's nearness in the quiet, warm and unmistakable, not in a sign or miracle, just in the simple goodness of people moved by his prompting. Sarah stepped toward the front of the chapel, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Lord, for what I didn't see coming." This was not the final blessing. This was the first turning, the moment God began restoring in ways she never could have imagined. Just as hope began to breathe again inside the old chapel, the sound of firm footsteps echoed through the doorway. Sarah turned, heart tightening as 3 town council members entered, their expressions stiff and unreadable. Michael stepped closer to her instinctively, as though bracing for impact. The councilman in front cleared his throat. "Miss Rowan, we were informed that you and several townspeople have been gathering here." Sarah nodded. hands clasped at her waist. Only to clean, to restore what we could. Nothing official. He exchanged a glance with the woman beside him, one of the same officials who had urged her to move on. "This building is not cleared for public use," she said sharply. "It's structurally outdated and has no current permit for gatherings." The room fell silent. "We must ask you to remove all items and leave the premises until further notice," the councilman added. "Failure to comply could result in penalties." The words struck like a second storm, quiet but devastating. The volunteers stood frozen among the lantern-lit shadows, the warmth that had filled the chapel moments before, now chilled by authority. Sarah stepped forward. "We're not trying to start a business. We're only—" "That doesn't matter," the woman interrupted. "This chapel cannot host any kind of public activity. You must clear it out." Her throat tightened. "But this is all we have left," she whispered. The council members didn't soften. They turned and left, the echo of their steps lingering long after they disappeared into the dusk. The door closed. Silence spread. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Michael exhaled slowly, frustration written across his features. "They didn't even listen." Mrs. Alden shook her head. "They don't see what God is doing here." The volunteers looked discouraged, deflated by the sudden weight of rules they couldn't fight. Sarah felt their disappointment like a burden on her shoulders. She walked to the front pew and sat, the lantern light stretching across the floor in trembling lines. She whispered, "God, please, not another closed door." Michael sat beside her, gentle but firm. "If God opened this, no one can shut it." She tried to believe him, but the blow hit deep. Loss had already torn through her life once. She wasn't sure she could endure another. That night, after the volunteers dispersed and Michael walked her home, Sarah entered her cottage with heaviness pressing against her ribs. The room felt colder, emptier, too quiet for a heart carrying such a mix of hope and fear. She knelt beside her bed, folding her hands with a trembling breath. "Lord, I trust you even when I don't understand. Strengthen me." The prayer poured out gently, carrying the weight she couldn't put into words. The next morning, before dawn, she returned to the chapel steps. She didn't know why. She only knew she needed to stand where hope had first flickered back to life. Fog drifted through the trees as she approached, soft and pale. She expected the chapel to be empty. Instead, 2 people stood at the entrance. Then 4, then 6. Within minutes, a quiet crowd gathered, neighbors, friends, former customers, even strangers who had once stepped into her shop seeking comfort. They arrived with small items in their hands, a fragrance she made years ago, a handmade journal she gifted to someone grieving, a note she once wrote to encourage a hurting widow. They began placing these items on the chapel steps, carefully, reverently, not as a protest, not as defiance, but as a testimony that her calling had reached lives far beyond the lantern house, a testimony that God had used her work long before the storm tried to erase it. Mrs. Alden stepped forward, speaking softly. "This place brings us peace. That's rare. Don't let them take it." A baker's elderly father added, "Child, God used your hands before. He's using them now." Sarah's chest tightened, emotion rising like a tide she couldn't stop. These people weren't standing for a building. They were standing for what God had done through her, even when she couldn't see it. And as more townspeople arrived, forming a quiet line that stretched down the hill, Sarah realized something profound. This wasn't a fight she could win by effort, but it wasn't hers to fight alone either. God was already moving, and the next step would reveal just how far he intended to restore what she thought was lost forever. The council members arrived sooner than anyone expected. Their car rolled to a stop at the foot of the hill, and the crowd grew still. Sarah's heartbeat thudded in her ears as the officials climbed the steps. eyes scanning the quiet gathering, the items laid gently on the stone, the reverent unity no one had planned but everyone felt. The same councilman who had ordered them to clear the chapel halted at the top, stunned. People stood shoulder to shoulder, young, old, families, widows, workers covered in the dust of early morning shifts, each holding something Sarah had once made, something God had used in their lives. No one spoke. The silence itself was a statement. Mrs. Alden stepped aside, revealing the items lined across the steps like a path of memories. The woman council member opened her mouth as if to enforce the rules again, but her voice faltered. She looked at the crowd, really looked, and something in her expression softened. "These all came from her?" she asked quietly. A man from the back stepped forward. "Yes, everyone. She prayed over what she made. Some of us found peace because of it. Some found hope." A mother lifted a small bottle of fragrance Sarah had created. "This helped my daughter sleep through her grief." An elderly man held a worn journal. "She gave me this after my wife passed. I wrote my way back to faith inside it." Dozens of quiet nods followed. The councilman's shoulders lowered, his sternness fading under the weight of what he was witnessing. He turned to Sarah, and for the first time his expression wasn't authoritative. It was humbled. "Miss Rowan, we didn't understand the impact you had." The woman beside him exhaled slowly, her voice gentler. "This chapel wasn't chosen by chance, was it? It seems something greater is happening here." Sarah felt her breath hitch, not in fear but in awe. She stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't ask for this. I only prayed for direction, and God brought me here." For a moment, no one moved. Then the councilman looked at the gathered items again, then at the people, then at Sarah, standing small but unwavering in front of the chapel door. He cleared his throat. "We may have judged too quickly. This place holds value we didn't consider. It wasn't approval yet, but it was the first crack in a wall she thought unbreakable." Sarah's eyes closed briefly. A wave of gratitude washed over her, a quiet, reverent gratitude that rose from deep within. She whispered under her breath, unseen but heard by the one who mattered, "Father, lead this. Keep my heart aligned with yours." When she opened her eyes, she felt a new certainty settle into her spirit. The storm had destroyed her shop. The community had doubted her. The council had dismissed her. But God had woven every moment, every tear, every loss, every prayer into a purpose far larger than the lantern house. The chapel wasn't an accident. The gathering wasn't coincidence. The resistance wasn't a setback. It was the unveiling of her true calling, not just to create fragrances, but to create a space where weary hearts could breathe again, a sanctuary of peace, a home for prayer. A place where God could meet his people in simplicity and quiet strength, and on that hillside, surrounded by lantern light and lives he had touched, Sarah understood. This was what the storm had made room for. This was the purpose hidden in the loss. In the days that followed, what began as a quiet gathering transformed into a movement no one in Willow Creek had expected. Volunteers returned to the chapel daily, not in protest, not in defiance, but in unity. They repaired broken beams, replaced loose floorboards, scrubbed years of dust from forgotten corners, and restored the place with reverence, as though preparing sacred ground. Michael organized the work, guiding everyone with calm steadiness. "This isn't rebuilding a building," he said. "This is rebuilding hope." Even the council members, moved by what they witnessed on the hill, began reconsidering the chapel's status. They arrived one afternoon with clipboards in hand, but softer expressions than before. Instead of shutting the doors, they inspected the structure carefully, listening, observing, taking notes with a caution that hinted at possibility. By the end of the week, the decision came. The chapel would be reopened, not as a commercial business, but as a community sanctuary for prayer, reflection, and gratitude. When Sarah read the document, her hands trembled. The same officials who once told her to move on were now validating a purpose she hadn't even seen in herself. The storm had tried to bury her work, but God had redirected it into something deeper, wider, eternal. The first night the chapel opened, people filtered in quietly, no programs, no announcements, just a place to breathe, to sit in stillness, to whisper prayers and offer thanks. Some came with burdens, some came with hope, some came because they simply needed a place where God felt near again. Sarah walked slowly down the central aisle, watching it all unfold. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt humbled, deeply aware that none of this was her doing. She paused near the front, closed her eyes, and let her heart speak the only words that felt true. Thank you, Father, for turning loss into purpose. As she opened her eyes, she saw Michael smiling from one of the pews, pride and peace written in his expression. Children sat along the walls, drawing pictures. Older residents prayed softly. Lanterns outside illuminated the walkway, guiding newcomers with gentle warmth. For the first time since the storm, Sarah's soul felt whole, not restored to what it had been, but shaped into something stronger, steadier, and rooted in God's leading rather than her own plans. The lantern house had been beautiful, but this sanctuary, was God's design, and Sarah felt it with every breath. She had finally stepped into the purpose he had been preparing all along. Winter settled gently over Willow Creek, laying a soft blanket of snow across the hill where the chapel now stood restored. Each evening, warm lanterns lit the walkway outside, simple, steady beacons guiding those who sought a quiet moment with God. The town had begun calling it the sanctuary at Willow Creek, a place where burdens loosened and peace returned like a steady breath. Children soon created a tradition of their own. They called it the Path of Praise, a line of small handwritten notes placed along the chapel steps, each one thanking God for something in their lives. Some notes were simple, "Thank you for my family." Others carried more weight, "Thank you for helping me through my sadness." But every note carried sincerity. Sarah watched them one evening from the doorway, her heart swelling with a quiet worship that rose without effort. She had once believed her life ended with the storm. Now she witnessed children praising God on steps that had once been marked for abandonment. Michael stepped beside her, brushing snow from his coat. "You created something beautiful," he murmured. She shook her head gently. "No, God did. I only followed where he led." She stepped forward, joining the line of notes on the steps. With careful hands, she placed one of her own at the beginning of the path, simple handwriting on a small piece of paper. "Thank you, Lord, for guiding me through the storm." The wind rustled softly, carrying her words upward, as if creation itself whispered Amen. Inside the chapel, a few townspeople sat in stillness, breathing in the peace that had once seemed impossible. Sarah paused at the doorway, taking it all in. She whispered softly, not with sorrow this time, but with awe, "You are faithful, God." The night was quiet. The sanctuary glowed. And Sarah understood that her story had become part of a greater one that would outlive her, touch others, and continue shaping hearts long after the storm was only a memory. Storms can sweep away what our hands have built, but they can never undo what God has planted in the heart. Sarah lost a shop, a dream, a sense of direction, yet in that loss, God opened a path she never would have chosen on her own. What felt like an ending became a doorway into purpose. What seemed broken became the foundation for something stronger. When life removes what we thought we needed, it may be clearing space for what God always intended. Trust His timing, trust His redirection, trust that every setback carries a lesson, every tear waters new growth, and every closed door protects a greater calling. When the night feels darkest, remember, God is already preparing the morning. Everything had a purpose.